Good morning and welcome to this year's Outlook Spartanburg Conference. I hope everybody can hear me and welcome. It's a little different this year, being that it's virtual, but we appreciate everyone joining us. I'm Wes Lair. I'm the market president for BB&T, now Truist, and I have the honor of serving as chair of the board for One Spartanburg, Inc. I would also like to introduce our presenting sponsors, Wells Fargo, Ethan Burrows. Ethan?
Thank you, Wes. As he stated, my name is Ethan Burrows, and I'm the market president with Wells Fargo here in Spartanburg. And I've also served as vice chair of economic development on the Chamber's executive board. We are always happy to support One Spartanburg, Inc. and the great work that they do in this community. And we're super excited this year about our Outlook Spartanburg event.
Me too, Ethan. We have 2 half days filled with exciting, informative sessions with great speakers, and you don't want to miss any of it. Today, our session will focus on economy, tourism, and our overall community forecasts.
Yes, and tomorrow we will provide a look into the 2021 legislative forecast and provide insight into what Spartanburg is doing around COVID-19.
2020 has definitely been a challenging year for all of us, but we look to 2021 with great promise as we work together in getting the Berg back to business. Normally, our president and CEO, Alan Smith, would be joining us today. He loves this event, and I know he appreciates all our speakers and presenters, but unfortunately, he's had a family emergency come up and is not able to join us, but he did want to express his gratitude to each one of you for joining today and sacrificing your time to join us. So big thank you from Alan, and a big thank you from our board. Ethan?
Thank you, Wes. So at this time, we're excited to start our first session of the day. Our speaker, Tim Quinlan, is a director and a senior economist with Wells Fargo Securities. Based in Charlotte, Tim provides analysis on the U.S. economy and major foreign economies. Tim's work has been published in academic economic journals, and his work is often cited in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and USA Today. Tim is also a frequent guest speaker on Bloomberg TV, as well as CNBC and the National Public Radio. Tim is a member of the National Association of Business Economics and the Canadian Association of Business Economics. And Tim is from Siena College, where he graduated up in Albany, New York. Tim has been a frequent speaker with us for over the past 10 years, and we're certainly glad to have him back. Now, if you have any questions during our presentation, please type them in the chat box. And if time allows at the end, we will address those. Now, Tim, I will turn the program over to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ethan. And thanks to all of you for making the time to join us today. We really appreciate the opportunity to be with you. And, you know, these sorts of events are tricky sometimes when you've never seen the person before and you don't know the people you're talking to. And I'm reassured to some extent that you know, so many of us know each other, and we've gotten to spend time together over the years. And this has become kind of an annual tradition for us. And for me, at least, that kind of officially kicks off the holiday season and puts me, you know, makes me feel like, you know, the holidays aren't so far away. So I've got a deck prepared here today, and, you know, Ethan talked about there being time, you know, enough to cover everything. And, you know, we've got a very hard stop at 8:50, and that's just so that we stay on schedule. So I'll aim to get through my content here with enough time to spare so that we're able to accommodate all of that. And so I'll kind of begin here with this look at, you know, one of the downsides of talking to the same group so many times is you guys know all my jokes, so I can't, you know, make a bad remark here about Virginia Tech, who Clemson's going to be playing on Saturday, because, you know, you guys see that one coming a mile away. So I got to try to bring some fresh material here. So let's just take a look at how South Carolina stacks up relative to some other states around the country. And one of the things I want to point out in this is, you know, let's begin with a short weather update. In Spartanburg, it's 29 degrees this morning. Here in Charlotte, where I am, is 27. And, up in the Northeast states where it's supposed to be so cold, my hometown of Buffalo, New York, it's 39 this morning. It's 36 in Boston. So I don't know, the old song that, from Pennsylvania, folks are heading down to Dixie's sunny shore. Well, yeah, they might be in for a surprise this year. I don't know what's going on with the weather, but what you can see here is what's going on with labor market dynamics. And, what you kind of can see from this is the kind of the darker the shades of purple here, the bigger the year over year declines. And so what you look for then is, so what are some of the hardest hit markets? And I think one of the keys to understanding the impact of this pandemic and what it's had on state and local situation is how much of employment in these areas is leisure and hospitality. How reliant is the economy on that as an industry sector? Or has this been a hotbed for coronavirus cases? And so you kind of look at the map with that as a mindset or a backdrop for this thing now, and you say, okay, so I see Nevada there down 8%, with Las Vegas and the tourism industry there. Kind of makes sense that they'd be down as much. New York down 10.2%. Sure, New York was the where the initial outbreak was the worst, and you can see we sometimes look past Hawaii on these sorts of maps, but you can see we've tucked Hawaii in there just south of California, and you can see that's the biggest year over year decline. Obviously, when you talk about an economy that's impacted by people's unwillingness to get on planes and travel and stuff like that, it makes sense that you'd see that kind of a slowdown there. And now we can find, South Carolina, yeah, we're down, but not down nearly as much as other parts of the country. And I think that's, at least to some degree, a little bit of a reassurance. But, let's keep in mind that we're not out of the woods yet with this crisis. So, the left-hand side of this chart gives you kind of just the overall COVID cases in South Carolina. And we are, the state is kind of doing better than the country as a whole. I'll have just the country in a second here, but you can kind of get a sneak preview of it by looking at the chart on the right-hand side, which shows that the dotted line there is COVID cases per 100,000 residents. And the left-hand side is just the total number of cases. And the reason I do that is just to sort of point out that we're although things are bad right now, they're not as bad as they were back in the summer months. Now, admittedly, South Carolina was among the worst in the summer outbreak. So the fact that we've got things, a little bit under better wraps right now is at least moderately reassuring. But if I could leave you with one big impression today, if you only remember one thing that I try to pass through in this, it's that the next few months are going to be pretty awful. I think that people are underestimating how bad it's going to be with the spread of the virus and the complacency around it. And I'm as guilty as anybody with it. I think, we were all very vigilant with the face masks and the social distancing at the outset. And it's hard to remain constantly vigilant for 8 months, especially when you've got, in my case, I've got teenage kids that want to go do stuff, and it's hard to keep telling them they can't go out and they can't do this and they can't do that. And you get lax about it. The whole country's doing that now, and we've got this wave that we've got to worry about. But the other half of what I'd like you to remember is, I think that the second half of 2021 is going to show an economy coming back with a vengeance. I think second half growth next year is poised to be a lot stronger than people presently think. And that's not fully reflected in the forecast data I'm going to show you today. And part of the reason for that is we're right at the cusp of our annual outlook update. That'll go out on Wednesday and Thursday of next week. The release happens Wednesday, and then we have our outlook webinar and call on Thursday. And I can give you some rough indications of how things are going to change with that forecast. But essentially, the virus having gotten worse makes the first quarter of next year a little bit weaker, a lot weaker. And then the arrival of a vaccine is a total game changer for the second half of the year. And I should say vaccines, because we've got 3 of them now. And when you kind of think about what all of this stuff means in the context of labor market activity more locally, Spartanburg is, I don't want to say impervious to these sorts of things, but if you look at the year-over-year declines in layoffs in employment, it's pretty sharp there, and you can see where people work in Spartanburg ranked from the densest amount of concentration to where the fewest people were. And, obviously, like the rest of the country, their leisure and hospitality is sharply lower, education and health services sharply lower. Some areas are still growing, manufacturing is still adding to jobs. You are seeing some areas beginning to grow a little bit. Another way to think about it is, how is the state as a whole rebounding here? And I think it's fair to say that we're kind of losing momentum. So in March and April, the state as a whole lost almost 300,000 jobs. You can see that in the chart on the left-hand side there. And then what we're keeping track of with our little Jello cake there of the different colors is how much of these jobs we've recouped. So, May we had a pretty swift rate of hiring across the state, June even more. But in the more recent months, you can see that we've been adding to payrolls at a much slower clip. And, this is kind of the same concept, except looking at it by industry. So a lot of the leisure and hospitality jobs have come back, but we're still seeing other industry sectors not quite so swift to begin hiring again. And, the one frustrating part of this is we're not totally out of the woods yet. You still see people filing first-time jobless claims at levels that are much higher than we would have expected to see pre-pandemic. So it's certainly not as bad as it was back in March and April. It's definitely come off the boil from where we were at that point. But 3,500 people filing jobless claims a week, that's still far too many in order to anticipate a swifter composition of rebound. When we look at income dynamics, you can see that people's income is down as a result of this. And, it's kind of I've never been a big fan of doing the whole on the one hand, on the other. And I'm not doing that here. I'm simply stating that although incomes are down, people's wealth is actually moving a little bit higher. That's if they're lucky enough to have, a stock portfolio or a retirement account that's in the stock market, or housing, because, your mileage may vary based on where you are here, but housing has been generally pretty strong throughout this pandemic, kind of an unexpected development. I'll show you some more data on that here in a second, but income is down a little bit. Now, despite that, you're seeing people kind of get back out there, pretty swiftly. So if you look at the chart on the left-hand side, we're using cell phone data here to get an indication of, people's returns to retail and recreational locations. And you can see Spartanburg is sort of the orange color there. And I think what that's more or less telling you is we're kind of getting back to normal. When you look at people going out to eat, well, we were really swiftly snapped back there. And, by the end of the summer, the number of reservations were kind of up above where they were pre-pandemic. And then things have kind of cooled off a little bit as people have been either limited by some of these stay-at-home orders, or, seating occupancy restrictions, or just not wanting to go out to eat with the virus flaring up. So we're back to recreational locations. We're back to going out to eat, but for the most part, a lot of office workers have yet to get back to work. So this is visits to the workplace, and the dips that you see there. There are a few different points where you've got these kind of dips. This is Memorial Day, 4th of July, and Labor Day. But what you're kind of coming away with here is people not rushing back to the workplace. Now, Spartanburg, with a denser concentration of manufacturing jobs, is sort of outpacing other regions in terms of the willingness to get back to their workplace. And that's something that we'll kind of keep an eye on to help gauge how consumer activity is faring. But what about the backdrop for housing in all of this? Well, here's where you really see pretty significant strength, remarkably, in this cycle. So here you've got home prices on the right-hand side, home prices in Spartanburg in South Carolina, and home prices in the rest of the country. And then on the left, you've got just overall residential construction activity. And this is, pretty remarkable. If you look at home building activity in Spartanburg today, it is comfortably north of where it was at the height of the housing bubble. So there's more single family construction activity going on today than there was back in 05 and 06. And that's a very unusual dynamic. You don't see that sort of thing in very many markets. And another dynamic that has made Spartanburg's housing market a little bit more resilient in this cycle is the fact that you may have had a pretty heady pace of multifamily construction in the prior cycle, but really throughout the course of this expansion, you haven't seen nearly as much of that multifamily. And while it's an oversimplification to say this, there's been less interest in multifamily and a bit more interest in single family homes, and so that is, I think, kind of helping to underpin price dynamics in Spartanburg. And you can, maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill here, but you can kind of see that with the trajectory of home prices continuing to rise in Spartanburg, even as they flatten out. The trajectory is still up, but not up as sharply in some of these other markets. So here's bringing it back to the pandemic. We saw cases for South Carolina before, not as bad as it was in the summer. Can we say the same about the country as a whole? Well, back in those summer months, we had, at the high water mark, about 80,000 new cases a day. Today, as of yesterday, it was 180,000, so more than twice as high. I know that the chart here only says 164, but there was a drop off in testing during the Thanksgiving holiday and the lead up to it. So you're now seeing much higher case counts. And I'll beg your pardon for using a kind of clinical term here, and I don't mean to sound like a cold-hearted guy. If you've had somebody who's gotten sick from this thing, or God forbid, someone who's died from it, I don't mean to sound insensitive when I say this. The blue line on the chart there is deaths. And if you look at deaths in relative to cases back when this thing first happened, it was a lot scarier than it is now. And when you look at deaths relative to cases more recently, any number of deaths is still too many, but relative to the total number of new cases, I think it's at least reassuring that the medical community is getting better at fighting this thing. Now, as I said before, I worry a lot about what the next few months look like with these case counts spiking the way they are. Even with the better ability to treat this thing, I'm afraid that we're going to have a pretty ugly few months here. But we get to the other side of that, and we've got the vaccines, and that ought to help us kind of dig our way out of that. So what does all this mean for the economy? Well, you're probably well aware of this. Things contracted really sharply in the second quarter. You had a big bounce back in the third quarter. I don't think you can count on that 33% annualized growth rate in the third quarter being the new steady speed. I mean, that's your reopening quarter. So you're not going to be able to repeat that again. But you do have continued expansion throughout the forecast period. And as I mentioned before, if I were changing how this looks a little bit, I think I'd take this guy, the first quarter, and I'd push that down a little bit. In fact, I wouldn't fight somebody if they said maybe you get a contraction in first quarter data and maybe it's a little bit slower in the fourth quarter. But then the second half of 2021 and into 22, I think I'm going to start to lift those numbers up, because once people are taking the vaccine and we achieve herd immunity, and for God's sake, we don't have to wear the face masks going to the grocery store and going out to eat. Can you imagine the pent up demand that we're going to have for vacations and travel and restaurants and concerts, sports, all this stuff that we've not been spending money on? I think that all starts to snap back in a pretty impactful way. So the overall shape of GDP growth, yes, you got a rebound, a V-shaped recovery. You're above your pre-recession peak of 2021, but that still leaves you with this output gap where we're a smaller economy than we thought we would have been, going into this pandemic. So the top line there is our forecast from the last time we talked. It was our forecast from December of last year. So obviously we didn't know a pandemic was coming at that point. And if you kind of compare the level of where we thought GDP would be at the end of this period versus where we actually are going to be, you got to kind of lower your expectations just a little bit in terms of where the economy is going to be. So how do we get there? What drives the expansion? What is it that convinces us that we're going to see this V-shaped recovery? I think it's really going to get back to their pre-recession peak. And I'd say a number of categories already have. It's not even a forecast. Many parts of the consumer economy have fully recovered already. Now, many parts are still well behind. So you're probably aware of the fact that restaurants are down, accommodations are down, transportation services are down. But if you look, that's not really that huge a share of consumer spending. Much larger is healthcare, which is more than double all of those previous categories put together, and also housing and utilities, which is the a really large chunk as well. And you look at all these blue categories, and these are kind of your goods outlays. And, some of these are down, but many of them have remained pretty strong throughout this period. And that's the opposite of what you'd expect. So the left-hand side is what you'd expect to see. The right-hand side is what we've actually experienced throughout this cycle. And the point here is that usually durable goods spending, that's the blue line in the chart on the left, usually that craters during the first year and a half of recession. So durable goods spending is, automobiles is the best example, but it also includes household appliances or four-wheelers, jet skis, stuff like that. And, people don't typically spend on that stuff when the economy is slipping into recession. What they do spend on, the green line in that left-hand chart, is services spending. So no matter how bad the economy is, people don't usually stop going to the doctor or stop staying current on their housing and utilities payments. So services spending usually remains pretty resilient. Now you look at the chart on the right-hand side, and this is what we've actually experienced. Everything fell out of bed during the lockdowns. And then what has rebounded swiftly? Non-durable goods, now up 5% relative to its pre-recession peak. Well, your two biggest categories of non-durable goods are gasoline and grocery store spending. Well, gasoline is actually still down, but grocery store spending is up quite a bit. So that's what's driving that one higher. But look at durable goods. Holy smokes, up 14% relative to the pre-recession peak. That's better than we'd ordinarily be 3 years into an expansion. And why is that? Because this money has been freed up from where we would be spending it otherwise. So this chart on the left gives you kind of a composition of spending. And just like the employment charts earlier, this is ranked by where the greatest number of people work to where the fewest people work. And what you sort of find here is wherever you've got a minus sign, wherever you've got spending still in contraction relative to where it was in February. So this is kind of a change from pre-pandemic levels till now. These guys almost always have services in it somewhere. So here's other services, healthcare services, recreation services, transportation services. These are all the categories that are in decline. And which are the ones that are up? You're probably already ahead of me now, all the goods categories. When you look at what that means in terms of retail spending, here's a breakout of three kind of cherry-picked categories of retail sales. So you've got the blue line there is bars and restaurants. The brown line there is basically grocery store and liquor store spending. And then the orange line is retail sales. So let's talk about the food spending stuff. So over the last 20 years or so, you've seen this shift from people spending most of their money at the grocery store and not going out to eat so much to the point where those had kind of converged and were even kind of changing to where people were spending more money going out to eat. You could attribute some of that shift to millennials. Millennials were much more interested in this experience economy, spending money out in the world, and not so much, cooking a meal at home like their Gen X and baby boomer people who came in front of them. So obviously COVID kind of turned that upside down. Everybody's, cooking at home now and can't go out to eat. And, whether by choice or by circumstance, you're kind of stuck making your own food at home. And then the other thing to point out here is the retail sales. So this has been the e-commerce. So that's what's called non-store retailers in that chart. And e-commerce has basically been, gradually increasing from the early 2000s. It's been taking a little bit of a bite out of the other categories every year. And then look what happened during the pandemic. All of a sudden, this got pushed, 4 or 5 years into the future with much, much more spending going into this e-commerce spending. And you might think, how is it that people are able to spend this money in the middle of a pandemic? What is driving that? Well, when you look at overall employee compensation, it's down. But if you look at compensation, including the benefits and impact payments and the additional unemployment benefits that have been paid out, people are actually doing okay. If you look at that kind of a trend line here throughout this period, it doesn't look meaningfully off where we would have been, even without this interruption. And that has led to a big increase in the saving rate. Look at how the saving rate shot up during the early part of this pandemic and remain at 13.6 in October, remains really elevated relative to the past 60 years or so, as you can see in the chart. And as households are stuck at home and not able to go on vacation and not able to go out to eat and not able to do this stuff, you end up with this kind of forced thrift. It's not that we've suddenly found religion and are eating beans and rice and, keeping track of our spending. It's not that. It's that you can't spend that money even if you wanted to. And when you look at the accumulated savings that we've got over the last few months, that's what this line shows you, is it adds the excess savings since this pandemic began. You're talking, comfortably north of $1 trillion now. And, people talk about, well, what will happen if we don't get a stimulus plan? Is the economy going to go, crashing down if we don't have another round of stimulus? And I think those sorts of reactions are a little bit misplaced because, one, we've got this banked up savings. And secondly, as you see in the chart on the right here, you look at these high income groups, folks making, 6 figures or more. It doesn't represent a very large share, as you can tell by the brown bars there. There's not many people in that group. But look at the blue bars. That's the spending that they do. The top 20% of income earners give you about half of your overall consumer spending. So, even in the absence of a stimulus program, I think that the economy is able to continue to grow. So here's our forecast for consumer spending. We see that kind of continuing to chug along. What about the outlook for manufacturing? That's certainly important to, even if you're not in a manufacturing industry in Spartanburg, it's important to the community and for spending in other sectors. So how does that look right now? Remarkably, manufacturing's held up pretty well. Now, you look at these numbers here during the pandemic. So this is March and April, the worst 2 consecutive months on record for industrial production. We've never seen production activity come to a halt like that. Not even during the war and I mean the Second World War. Not even then did we see industrial production contract like that. But we've had some pretty steady growth. Only one miss in the 5 or 6 months since then. So steady expansion in manufacturing activity. And so here's our forecast for where we see things going. And I'll grant you, it's not as swift as a rebound as we've got for the rest of the economy. If the rest of the economy is going to be back to its pre-recession peak, middle part of 2021, maybe industrial production takes till the middle part of 2022. But you compare that to prior cycles, like here after 2009 or here after 2001, it took 4 or 5, in the case of the last cycle, almost 6 years to get back to the pre-recession peak. So this rebound that we're anticipating in this cycle reflects a much swifter rate of recovery. And I felt like I had my neck stuck out there a little bit with that until we got the third quarter GDP figures. And take a look at this equipment investment spending in the third quarter. I don't think we'll ever see numbers like that again. 66.6%. That is a really, really strong rate of growth there, and really genuinely unprecedented. We've never seen growth of that magnitude before. Obviously that's your reopening quarter, but it's also it wasn't only COVID that was holding back equipment spending. You also had we talked about this last year at the Outlook event. We talked about the impact of the trade war, and look at what that was doing to capital equipment spending really throughout the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, we had 5 consecutive quarterly declines in equipment spending, prior to this rebound that we saw here. So it was more than just COVID that held that stuff back. It's looking pretty decent now. When you look at the production pipeline, you look at orders and business sentiment in the manufacturing sector, all of those guys are pointing in the right direction. Now, the ISM index came down from 59 to 57. It's still a pretty swift pace of expansion there. Manufacturing is able to keep on chugging even in the middle of a pandemic. You might have, U.S. consumers squawk about wearing a face mask, and people say, well, you're taking away my rights if I've got to wear a face mask to go into the store. But you don't deal with that grief when you're in the manufacturing. Guys are used to this stuff. Hey, put on a hard hat before you go into the plant. Put on gloves. Put on a face mask. It's no big deal. So they've been able to implement that stuff relatively quickly and get back to work. And the implementation of social distancing is a lot easier on a shop floor than it is in an office where people have got to gather to do the things they do. So I think things are kind of coming back pretty swiftly there. We talked about housing dynamics in Spartanburg. Here's how it looks for the country as a whole. You've not seen this pace of new or existing home sales at any point during the prior expansion. You've got to go all the way back to the housing bubble to see such a swift pace of selling activity. In the case of existing homes, there's just not nearly enough inventory out there. People are, you list your house right now and there's multiple bids on it. People are buying properties sight unseen. We had a couple people move into our neighborhood during the pandemic period, and one of them didn't see the house for the first time until they were unpacking their stuff. It's just a remarkable thing to me that people can do that. But it's a seller's market right now, and then part of the reason for that is mortgage rates are the lowest they've been in the living memory of anybody right now, and that kind of makes houses that might otherwise have been out of reach a little bit more affordable for would-be buyers. The commercial real estate backdrop is a little bit different. I'm going to skip a couple here. If you kind of look at the two main, the best performers of commercial real estate, from 2010 to 2019 was apartments and office space, but only office space in the central business district, not so much in the outside in the suburbs. So how has that stuff fared throughout this cycle? So what you're looking at here is apartment supply and demand. So the blue bars indicate the number of units that the builders are putting up, and then the brown bars represent the number of people that are moving in, or your absorptions. And so if absorptions are growing faster than completions, then your vacancy rate comes down, and vice versa. If they're building more than people are moving into, your vacancy rate goes up. And so now you can kind of get a sense of how the last cycle went, with the vacancy rate kind of largely coming down in the first half of the cycle, and then at various points over the last 5 years, builders getting over their skis a little bit, building a little bit too many. This is not an issue in Spartanburg. It is a bit more of an issue in other parts of the country. When you look at office space, this was a little bit different. It was a long, gradual kind of soaking up of the excess inventory from the prior cycle. And then I think you could say from about 2018 on, I wouldn't say there's been way overbuilding, but I think that builders have at least matched the absorption. So they've at least created new office space for every person that needs new office space. And in the last few quarters, certainly since the pandemic began here, you've seen the absorptions really drop off, and they're finishing projects that began before the crisis, and so the vacancy rate is coming back up here. Interestingly, when you look at just how swiftly those absorptions are coming off here, minus 33.1 million in the third quarter. These are not trends that you annualize either, or these aren't trends that you extend well into the future either. This is still, we're in the midst of a trying to get a price around what office space looks like, and we're really not going to. Nobody can tell you with any definitive authority how this stuff looks on the other side of the crisis. But will many financial firms need the same floor space that they had at the end of 2019 now that they've effectively demonstrated how well we are able to do our jobs remotely? I would argue probably not all of that. There are many of us are eager to get back to the workplace, and I think that there will always be some demand for office space, but it may not be as robust as it was before the crisis. We've talked about a lot of things, some doing well, some doing not so well. The job market has just been much slower to rebound than other parts of the economy. Yes, consumer goods spending is strong. Yes, the stock market's strong. Housing market's booming, but you still have 750,000 people filing first-time jobless claims every week. That's way, way too high. You might have seen news earlier this week from the OMB that there's some speculation that these numbers aren't being calculated as cleanly as they used to be because all of the various relief programs going on right now. Hard to make comments around that without owning the data myself. I'd simply say, that's kind of always the case. You never get a real clean read on the labor market until you're looking at it in the absence of these various stimulus measures that kind of provide people extended jobless benefits. Our expectation, though, is, we've got the overall economy getting back to its pre-recession peak and many other parts of the economy getting back quickly, we don't anticipate the labor market fully recovering by the end of our forecast period. So the unemployment rate doesn't get as low as it was. The total number of people on non-farm payrolls never returns to its pre-recession peak between now and the end of 2022. So it's a frustratingly slow rebound for the labor market. Just a couple of quick comments on this stimulus stuff. So this these bullets under phase 5 here, this is kind of the sort of things that we'd expect to see in a stimulus program. And there are a couple of different bills being floated right now in Capitol Hill. I don't pretend to have any particular insight on how things are going to shake out there, but the kinds of things that they're arguing about are, whether or not to extend jobless benefits for people, whether or not to provide direct funding to cities and municipalities. I think that should be a pretty high priority. Whether or not we have an expansion of work retention credits. What about money for schools? There's always a little bit of horse trading with money for schools. Republicans will say you can have money for schools, but only if you reopen them. And Democrats say, well, you should have money for schools that funds more virtual programs. So they've got a lot of things to iron out with that. What about the election and what implication does that have for all of this? Well, you could go line by line through all these policy things and drive yourself crazy. Biden wanted to do a lot of really robust stuff, but if he doesn't have control of the Senate, then it's going to make it pretty difficult for him to do that. Obviously, we've got a special election in Georgia that will determine whether or not Democrats retain control of the Senate, but I'm not holding my breath that's going to happen. And so what you end up with is divided government. And so none of these proposals get through the way that they're laid out here. You probably are dealing with a situation where you don't get any real big sweeping changes in fiscal policy. You'll get some kind of an expansion of unemployment benefits. There'll be some way that they create a little bit of revenue through either increases in the corporate tax rate or exclusions of some kind of a popular tax deduction for personal income tax. But these really progressive measures that Biden talked about during the campaign, I think that's going to be harder to do. Who's better for the stock market? There's not a real good answer to that one. And people give me arm twisting on this all the time. Like, you got to be kidding me. Democrats are better. Republicans are better. Here is every first term president since Richard Nixon. And this is the performance of the stock market from the last trading day before their inauguration day until October in their 4th year. And the takeaway here is there's no discernible, repeatable trend for who does better and who's got the best kind of numbers here. It's actually a case that when you get divided government, things tend to work the best. When they eventually figure out what they do, I hope that they don't have these overly generous jobless benefit programs. So this is a look at a program we had during the summer where they bolted on an extra $600 a week to state level unemployment benefits. And we can kind of see in the chart here is that more than half of the states, people were earning more on unemployment than half the people that were out there working. So that's probably not the sort of thing that we ought to have if we want to encourage a robust rebound in the labor market. And whatever we do, we've got to worry about budget deficits that are stretched pretty thin here. This is a chart that I bring with me every year when we have our usual meeting. I think you know where I stand on this. For those of you who are hearing this for the first time, this is just a look at how your government has spent your money for the last 44 years. So anytime this line here is below this flat zero line, it means they're spending more money than they're taking in. And we have a long history of spending more money than we take in. That's why we've got a big national debt. But at least what you usually see is during expansions, we narrow the budget deficit, or the amount of money that they're taking in relative to what they're spending, kind of shrinks. And, this has kind of not been the case throughout the prior cycle, which means we went into this thing with 4.5% budget deficits. So we find ourselves today with, the largest budget deficits as a share of GDP that we've seen since the Second World War. So not a particularly great backdrop there. I've got, as we mentioned earlier, we've got a hard stop at 8:50. So I've got 9 minutes here. I'm going to just quickly give my spiel on the Fed. Fed has taken interest rates effectively to zero, short-term interest rates. Even longer-term interest rates came with it. The yield in the 10-year Treasury had gotten down as low as 50 basis points for a while. It's spiking this week. It's up to 90 basis points or something, still below 1%. And what the Fed has essentially done is said we're going to take rates really, really low. We're going to keep buying mortgage-backed securities and treasuries, and even new things like municipal bonds and, in some instances, covered corporate bonds, all in this bid to make sure that the financial markets have access to the capital that they need. Businesses have access to the capital they need. And that's part of the reason why, even in the midst of a pandemic, you saw, this really robust snapback in the stock market and, your business is able to find capital market financing through new debt issuance and those sorts of things. And one of the new things they've said is we're willing to tolerate inflation north of 2% for a while. And here's kind of the history of inflation over the last 15 years or so. And the Fed has this 2% objective, and really for the last 10 years or so, it's been a fleeting objective. It's very difficult to achieve that. So they said for a while, if inflation overshoots, we still won't start to raise interest rates. And this is after they pumped a lot of money into the system. So both the monetary base, which is money that banks have on deposit at the Federal Reserve, as well as the money supply. This is a more conventional cash definition. This is checking account balances, saving account balances, CDs, stuff like that, overall cash in circulation. And that is up quite a bit. And if you got all this extra cash chasing the same goods and services, well, you'd expect to see inflation from that, right? Well, one of the problems is the velocity of money has slowed. It's chasing only goods. It's not chasing goods and services. And this is why we've got a national coin shortage. And you've got, people putting those signs in their register, like, please pay with your ATM card or your credit card because, we don't have change to give you because the velocity of money has slowed. Bank lending in some instances has slowed. And so I'm not holding my breath that we see, runaway inflation. Here's kind of our forecast for where we see that headed. And, ultimately, I think it's going to be a tough thing for them to pull that off. So that wraps up my formal remarks here with 6 or 7 minutes to spare. And hopefully at some point along the way, I've elicited a question from somebody out there, or maybe someone just disagrees and wants to pick a bone with me. So glad to field any questions that you may have at this point.
Hey, Tim, this is Ethan. I don't think that we've gotten any questions so far this morning. So I just want to thank you for this valuable information and appreciate you being here with us again this year. You always do a great job. And so thank you again. Wonderful information. And if anybody does have questions later on, you can certainly email the chamber and we'll get those questions answered for you. So Wes, I'm going to turn the program back over to you.
Sounds great. Yeah, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Ethan. Great job as always. Very, very insightful. So much appreciated. All right. Before I provide instructions on assessing our next session, which is one you don't want to miss, it's led by our Chief Economic Development Officer, Catherine O'Neill. I'd like to thank our sponsors. This virtual event would obviously not be possible without them, and much appreciated. Given that it's a little bit different this year. So I'm gonna roll through the sponsors real quick. They may be popping up on your screen. Our gold sponsors include Denham Blythe, Founders Federal Credit Union, McMillan Paz & Smith, Park National Bank, Purpose Financial, Spartanburg Community College, Spartanburg Water, Centerra Corp. Our platinum sponsors include Agape Care South Carolina and Spartanburg Herald Journal. Our legislative sponsors, which is tomorrow's event, is Duke Energy. And then our presenting sponsors is J.M. Smith Foundation. And let me take a quick minute and mention that we lost a very dear friend, Jimmy Wilson, this year. Huge asset to Spartanburg and really where it is today. Just always been a big supporter of One Spartanburg. Our hearts just go out to Jimmy's family and just continue to keep them in your prayers, especially during this holiday season. Last, thank NAI, Earl Furman, and Wells Fargo, also as presenting sponsors. So again, very, very much thank you to all our sponsors. And now, don't go away. Actually, leave this session up. We'll be right back for the next session starting promptly at 9 a.m. We'll hear about our 2021 economic future of Spartanburg. We have panelists David Britt, Sue Schneider, John Montgomery, and Caleb Beasley, which is going to be moderated by our own Catherine O'Neill. So we'll see everybody right back here at 9 a.m. Thanks so much.